On today's episode, you'll hear about poor, brainwashed individuals who value their work ethic, which is obvious exploitation. How small businesses are only run by the mega wealthy who want a class war on the poor. Josh Hawley's brilliant plan to raise the minimum wage only on the rich companies with absolutely no unintended consequences. And, well, actually a whole lot more about minimum wage than I can even fit here. This is Cringe Posts. Welcome to this episode. We're here to take on the online takes that make you cringe. I'm Donald.
And I'm Britt.
And we're going to get started, but before we start critiquing other people, we've got to critique ourselves. And we've got the Ron Paul bashing train back in the station here. Ron Paul is an isolationist who would leave us open to another 9/11. This, man. I feel like this could be copy and pasted from, I don't know, Republican Club women of King County or something. I don't know. It just seems so, it's so evergreen for the classic Republican line. I love it.
Dude, I mean, I was just doing my best Rudy Giuliani impersonation, I think. That was... Yeah, I remember just hearing someone say this, and I was like, oh, like, he doesn't want to go kill people in the Middle East. That must mean he's an isolationist. That must be bad. Mm-hmm. And I definitely bought into the thought that the Two Towers happened because they hated us for our freedom.
Yeah.
Oh,
I don't understand how that line makes any sense.
It makes no sense.
But it's what we all spouted at the time, right? They hate us for our freedom. We repeat like little robots, and
so let's reduce your freedom. Let's reduce our freedoms. They hate us for our freedoms, and they must have won because they took all of them away with the Patriot Act.
Right. I think my favorite thing about all of this, in retrospect too, is that 9/11 was, in terms of the safety protocol, it was a failure of the massive surveillance state that was being set up that none of us knew existed at the time. Because if you look back at the records, I think it was either Ron or Rand Paul brought this up years ago. I think it was the FBI and the CIA, like, each had pieces of this attack that was coming in. They kind of had some things, and there was just so much crap they were surveilling. They never communicated. It was such a huge bureaucratic mess that none of the pieces connected. So, ironically, Ron Paul, as an isolationist who would leave us open to another 9/11, actually, if he had his way, we probably would have much less of a bureaucratic mess in any kind of, horrible state spying apparatus. But furthermore, there would be much less foreign activity overseas, which would reduce any kind of incentive. But even if the incentive was still there, it would greatly reduce the amount of communications you have to intercept. And you'd probably have people being like, oh, this guy said this guy said that. Let's connect the dots and keep this from happening.
Yeah, I had the pleasure of waking up one of my buddies to this a few months back, because he was kind of giving the same line about, well, they hated us for our freedom. I was like, no, like, imagine if a foreign country, like let's say Mexico, came in and they bombed a bunch of cities, killed thousands of people, starved 500,000 of our children, and then set up military bases all around our country and told us what we could and couldn't do, and then controlled our oil prices and starved us. Do you think we would do something about it? I think we probably would, right? Mm-hmm. And it probably would look a lot more like bombing them than just flying planes into their their cities or whatever. And that's just and once I put it that way, he finally kind of woke up to what was really going on. And honestly, he didn't have any awareness, right, of like Madeleine Albright saying, well, I think it was worth it to starve 500,000 Iraqi children, in the 90s. And that's really what woke me up too, right? Like I just hadn't thought about it. I hadn't really thought of anything. To me, history of us being in the Middle East started on 2001,
right?
Because that's when it first affected me. But in reality, we'd been there doing stupid stuff for years, decades. And just to as cliche as it is, those who are ignorant of history are doomed to repeat it.
Right.
And in the U.S. government's case, very well aware of history, yet still repeat it.
Yeah. Well, and it's just a couple days past Ron Paul Day, as the online community has called it, which was the day he was on the debate stage in South Carolina with Rudy Giuliani, and he talked about this, and he talked about blowback.
Guts, dude.
And it wasn't that day that I was watching that debate that cued me into that, but it was that moment that really turned, because I thought, oh, wait a second, that makes way more sense. And then I looked into things and I was reading about things like, oh my gosh, Iran and the Shah, and this goes back to the 50s, and oh my goodness. And then when you piece those things together, you kind of have that moment of awakening. So thank you, Ron Paul. I don't think you would leave us open for another 9/11, even if
it might have
even
prevented
if past
it, actually.
Britain. Yeah, you never know. All right, so on to our quick cringe segment. We've got a lot of business today. So if minimum wage goes up, businesses will just raise prices, in quotes. So you agree. Businesses use whatever tools they have at their disposal to keep the working class poor, and capitalism requires exploitation and poverty. This is not the argument you think it is. This is class war. And of course, as we all know, every business owner is just sitting on heaps of money, and so when minimum wage increases, that's like nothing to them, and they can keep operating, and they can sleep on their beds made of solid gold.
Twirling their mustache and adjusting their monocle as they laugh.
Yeah.
It's these posts never get old, because it's just such a fundamental misunderstanding of supply and demand and variable costing. There is a set price for things. Cost things, right? And if you are if you're not meeting those costs, if you're not making 1 cent above that cost, then you can't stay in business. Mm-hmm. And wages are just a reflection of what people are willing to work for to perform a certain service or act or anything like that. And there's just this weird moral superiority about I think I should force a business to pay someone X amount, but I have no logical justification or reason for why I think that they should be paid that. One of my favorite moments on Joe Rogan that sticks out to me is when Peter Schiff is like, well, Joe, how could you pay someone $10 when they only generate $9 worth of value? Mm-hmm. That just doesn't pencil. It doesn't work. And Joe, finally got it. Why you can't have arbitrarily set the minimum wage. The minimum wage, in a business, what it should be is, the amount that a business uses to make sure they have good quality staff that can provide excellent service and generate a profit. And that it shouldn't go above or below that. If it gets outside of that range, then you're going to have inefficiencies. You're going to have low staffing, or you might have, unqualified people working your business. And that's a nice signal for the business about, where they're pricing in the market. One of the reasons that software engineers are so in demand is because they provide a lot of value, right? One software engineer, the solutions they build scale out over potentially millions of people, right? And millions of people paying for that service. And so they're paid a lot because they're in high demand, right? Whereas if you're a burger flipper, there are tons of people that can do that, right? And burgers cost X amount. There's an X amount of dollars that people are willing to pay to have a burger. And so the total cost of delivering that service can't exceed that, or else the business won't exist.
I think what makes me laugh about the last line here, this is not the argument you think it is, this is class war. It makes me think of that Stone Toss comic, which I don't know if you're familiar with or not, but it's this picture of... I don't even remember the original context. It's been used as a meme format so much. It might actually have been about minimum wage originally. If not, it's definitely been made into that, where it's this tug of war over this cliff. And on one side, it has, proponents of raising the minimum wage, like these left liberals or whatever. And on the right, you have business owners that are trying to stay in business. And then you look on the side with the guys trying to raise the minimum wage, and behind them is a capitalist in a monocle like Amazon and Walmart and big business helping them pull. And the guy's looking behind him and seeing, another, and it's just the unlikely ally. And he's like, huh? And it just makes me laugh because this is class war. Because obviously Amazon, Walmart, these are the companies that are going to be hurting in this scenario, right? It's not like they're going to be able to absorb these minimum wage costs. It's not like they're going to be able to cut employees if they need to, still operate fine, and run their minor competitors out of business or anything. It's just funny that that's the approach they're taking as far as class war goes. Again, not the argument you think it is, mister.
Well, it's just the first line. If minimum wage goes up, businesses will just raise prices. It's okay, let's take Walmart, right? The infamous Walmart. like I think they generated hundreds of billions of dollars, right?
Mm-hmm.
Their profit margin on that is literally less than 1%, right? If they generated,
Right.
I think they generated like $400 billion in 2019, and they took home in profit about $4 billion,
Mm-hmm.
right? And if you spread that out among the hundreds of thousands of people they employ, like you could maybe boost. So if you took all profit, all motive to generate more money to actually reinvest and build up the business, you gave it and dispersed it among the employees, it would equate to something like 2 cents extra an hour, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
that should just demonstrate the fundamental reality, right? Like prices either have to go up, wages have to go down, but there is a set amount of price to delivering food to Walmart, having it sit in a freezer, powering that freezer, and then having someone that can check you out. And if people want their cheap food, if they want the ability to go buy things at a discount, something's got to give. There's a cost associated with it, and so prices will go up, right? Or they'll go up to make some sort of profit margin, or the business won't exist. And like I said, I appreciate what you were saying earlier too about like the little guy. It's like that's who it hurts the most. The biggest
Mm-hmm.
proponents of these these regulations. Like I was thinking about like Warren Buffett with his railroads. He loves all of the different like pipeline regulations because it means that everyone has to keep using his railroad companies.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and it gets in the way of like actual cheaper fuel. Like when it comes to actually transporting like gas and oil across the country, pipelines are like way more safe, way more energy efficient. They have less less spills than transporting by railroad or by truck. And on top of it, like they don't use as much gas, right? So they're actually
Mm-hmm.
more green for the environment and all that stuff. But because of all the propaganda and Warren Buffett, funding these different types of green initiatives, the country seems to think that pipelines are bad.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, we'll get to talking about the supposed solution to minimum wage hurting the little guys in a bit. That's going to be our last quick cringe and into our long form cringe.
Yep.
So I'll refrain from harping on that too much more, and we'll move to our next one here. It's a quote again. I worked 80 hours this week. I'm on my grind, and then a picture of Lord Farquaad from Shrek. The worker has fallen in love with the system that exploits them.
I was thinking about the word exploits.
Yeah.
Because it's like to exploit someone would mean they worked 80 hours and they only got 10 hours worth of benefit from it.
Right.
But usually if you work 80 hours, you're probably getting 80 hours of benefit from it. So how is that exploitation, right? Like you
Right.
did the amount of work and you got the amount of result from it that you put in.
Yeah. Well, I
That's
will
a kind
say,
of nice thing to fall in love with, right? Getting results and
yeah.
your work leads to something. Like
I will say there are, I think usually in maybe big corporations, there are unhealthy work
Sure.
expectations that can exist. The problem is that people equate that to every single idea of working 80 hours this week and people being on their grind. And they demonize the idea of people who enjoy that and want to do that. So I don't think that necessarily you should have that expectation if you hire someone for 40 hours and you pay them for 40 hours and they have to work 80 hours. Maybe not, but usually what you need to be emphasizing is not the idea that, oh man, this person's fallen in love with an exploitative system. It's like, no, they've hired you to do X job, and that might take 40 hours, that might take 80 hours, but you've been hired and you're being paid to get this end result. So if that requires 80 hours of work, and if you're proud of that work you're doing and you are getting, then that's awesome because you are generating the value and you're doing what you've done. You're doing what you've been hired to do. Or maybe you're working 80 hours because you're going above and beyond what you're being paid to do.
Yeah.
And at that point, you shouldn't be punished and you shouldn't be mocked and ridiculed. You should, if you're providing value, and as long as that's the choice that you want to make. Who am I to tell you that is the wrong choice? That's, maybe you can argue that, oh, maybe they should be spending time with their family, but I don't know that. Maybe it's someone who's single. Maybe they're trying to specifically build up their skill set so that they can have a more profitable career and take more time off in the future to be with their family. You can't make that call for anyone else. And when you demonize someone who's putting in work and creating value, you send the wrong cultural message, I think.
Yeah, and there's a big difference between like critiquing the hustle culture thing, like Gary Vee and all those videos like you need to work 90 hours and blah, and the Amazon culture and all that. But that's not what they're doing in this. They're saying it's exploitation, right? It's like, yeah, there's a lot of issues with that. Like there's work-life balance, and one of my buddies was talking to me about it, and it's like, yeah, like if you work a normal job, you should be able to get your job done in 40 hours a week because there's diminishing returns every hour after 40, right?
Right.
And if you're doing it right, 40 hours. If you're doing it wrong, then yeah, you're going to work a lot. And the thing is, though, it's like to learn, you have to do a lot of things wrong. You have to fail. And like he was talking to me about like startup life. It's like in a startup, yeah, you're going to fail a lot. That's why founders and co-founders of startups work tons of hours, is because you're learning, you're building, you're breaking things. And you have to do that. And because you love creating, like that's the process of it, then you do like naturally love working 80 hours because it's not the amount of time you work. It's like, I just can't help myself. I have to do it because it's awesome. That doesn't sound like exploitation to me. That might not always be healthy, especially if you have a family, if you have kids or whatever. But that's a whole different discussion, discussing about like healthiness and work-life balance. If you're getting the result that you like and you feel happy and someone's paying you for the time that you put in and the results that you got, like, that's not exploitation.
Well, and a lot
and
of
the fact that they would heist that on us too, right? That's like, you're being exploited. It's like, oh, how arrogant of you to assume you know how I am.
That's exactly what I was going to say, is that so often, again, in this scenario, the person's like, I'm on my grind with the little, flexing emoji. That person in that phrase is proud of either the end result or the effort they've put in. They are taking away some kind of value from that. So to use that exploit language is so harmful and disgusting. This makes me think of my brother. He works a full-time job, and then he does a lot of like internet streaming and community building, and he does development for online community stuff, like different projects. He puts in so much work and creates so many things, and sometimes he gets paid for them. Like if he creates a big YouTube video and it gets a lot of views and he gets monetization from that, or it draws in people to his stream. He builds a brand for himself, though. That's the biggest thing, is he's working all these extra hours and he's getting something of value. He's creating something he likes. He's creating something that has value to other people, and then he's creating a value for himself in terms of branding and skill set and all that kind of thing. And so he's working more than full-time hours on things that people could consider, a job, but he loves it because he gets value out of it, and that's super cool. Yeah. And by the end of it, usually more than just what he takes away for himself, you can see the end result of these awesome products that he gives away often for free, or creates just to share with these communities and stuff. So it's not to say it's exploitation in this context. It's like you have to draw this arbitrary line where it's like, if you're doing this in the context of a business contract, then it's going to be exploitation. But if you're doing it because it's your hobby, well, that's okay because you're not contracted to do so. But again, if you're choosing to do this and you're getting the job done, and you want to go above and beyond that, that's still your choice, whether you're contracted to do that or not. And if you're not getting the job done, well, then you're probably not going to be proud of putting in 80 hours. So this example isn't really accurate.
Yeah. There's plenty of people in the world that are exploited, right? And that's that's just kind of the ugliness of this kind of... I get it, it's tongue-in-cheek, right? It's a meme, but regardless, it's just kind of an ugly thing to say, both to the people that do enjoy it as well as the people who are actually exploited. Yeah. Again, just one of those things, you scroll in the timeline, you cringe, and you're like, no, can't let that slide. Gotta call them out for that. So, all right. And so this last quick cringe is going to lead into our long-form cringe, because I, maybe foolishly, I don't know, quote retweeted it, and so we have a chain with a little conversation that I ended up having with someone on here. But let's talk about the original source here from blue checkmark Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri. The biggest corporations in America can afford to pay their workers $15 an hour. Raise the minimum wage for big business, not small business. Okay. I feel like we've talked about this in another episode, but when you try to control the economy in a way where you try to hold for try to force certain outcomes by holding part of the process, inevitably things will worm around, you screw someone over, and then they will go back to the way they were before, or cutting out the least privileged and able in the system. If you force big corporations to pay $15 an hour, and you don't set that
imposition on small businesses, what do you think happens when anyone tries to get a job? Where are they going to go? And why would anyone want to work for one of these smaller businesses that's not going to pay them an artificially higher rate when you're living in middle America, where the minimum wage is something like $8 an hour, and you're doing the same job but getting double the pay at Walmart? No one is going to want to apply for work at the small business. And the thing to remember is, it's not even a matter of, well, these people are just not, they're going to need to find a job, so someone will have to work at these small businesses. No, I think if anything, this past year of COVID should more than ever before convince people that if people can get paid with unemployment benefits to not work, or if they don't view the trade-off for going back to work as valuable enough, they will not do that. So in the COVID case, let's say you go to work. Let's say you would get more money than unemployment benefits, but let's say you're getting paid $13 an hour to stay at home, and you get paid $15 an hour to work a job. You're not really working for $15 an hour at that point. You're working for $2 an hour, because if you do nothing, you get paid $13 an hour. And so in this case, it's like people are going to look at this and say, well, why would I go to work at a small business when if I'm not going to get hired by Walmart? If they're paying $15 and this pays $8, I'm working for like -$7 if I get a job. I'm just not going to even bother and just wait for Walmart to hire me when they kill that small business around.
Yeah, it's just a total disregard for how things cascade through the economy. And it's like, okay, sure, like let's totally disregard everything you just said, right? Like that, let's hypothetically say all small businesses are able to keep their people. Like, where do you think these small businesses are able to get the materials for their business to scale up? Like, they get it from the big businesses, right? Yep. So that $15 an hour wage that you're forcing the big businesses to pay, that cost is going to get passed off to the small businesses, right? Mm-hmm. So all prices go up, and that's why we see crazy inflation basically anywhere this type of policy is implemented, because whenever you change any input in the economy without regard to, the actual market demand for it, you force companies to make adjustments that they otherwise would not have. And I know we're going to talk about this a little bit more here in a second, and that really screws up the equation. And they're not able to actually read the market signals and adjust in such a way that brings out the most efficient outcome. And everyone suffers because of it, not just big business, but small business, both in their ability to hire labor, but as well as their ability to, compete in prices. And I had a guy when I was in college come in to speak, and he had been like a regional sales director for Staples, and he was talking about the CTAC $20 an hour minimum wage. He's like, oh yeah, this is going to be awesome. Like, for my company, like, we'll just take a loss for like 2 years at my business, and we'll drive out all of the mom and pop shops all around, and then we'll just we'll raise our prices again, right? And that's how and when you're in a competition, that's how everyone thinks, right? Because when you're at Staples, you've got the weight of a multi-billion-dollar company behind you. You can kind of outlast a couple bad years, right? And take a loss to drive out your competition. Like, it's a strategic decision. And it's a strategic decision that's kind of not bolstered, but like it comes as a result of this external government mandate, handed out with the under threat of using the gun on you. And they're able to, it's no coincidence that we see all this money pooling into the richest 400 people in the country. It's because these mandates force it to happen. Yeah.
So it's a complete misunderstanding of economics, and of course this is supposed to be some conservative hero, and it just it goes to make me laugh and think, like, why you would have any hope for the Republican Party when he's one of the conservatives. He's not a rhino. He's not Mitt Romney. This one's one of the good ones, right? And you're like, oh man,
Missouri.
If I have to pick between Mitt Romney and Josh Hawley, I'm sorry, I'm out. That's a terrible choice to be in. So, any more thoughts on this, or I think we can move into
let's lead into it.
The motherload. Okay, so I quote retweet this.
Oh, you're consistent.
Yeah. For once, I'm not cringing at my own tweet here, except for maybe the consequence of having it spiraled into a long conversation. But, this man is dumber than I originally thought, and that is a truly amazing feat. So, just kind of some smack talk on Twitter, because that's what you do on Twitter. And I have someone who I've kind of known from online, so we're not doxing him, but not a complete random, but we obviously have a different eye to eye on some of this. So we're gonna go through and read and sort of take apart these replies, and my replies are not in all of them. There's, I think, one is included just to give you context to what he's replying to for one of them. But that being said, so in reply, he says, kind of confused. Why can't big corporations do at least $15 an hour? It's not even a living wage or a very competitive wage either in most areas, I'm assuming. Okay, so we've kind of already talked about the original tweet, but what I do want to point out about this one is he says, it's not even a living wage or a very competitive wage either in most areas, I'm assuming. Right there, that should clue you in to the complete disconnect this person has from reality, which this person lives in California. And that is why they think that $15 an hour is not a very competitive wage in most areas, they assume. It is. In most areas across the United States, that is a competitive wage. Like I said, I think minimum wage in many Midwest countries is, I think, or excuse me, states is, I think, $7 to $8, something like that. So if that's your baseline, $15 increase doubles it, basically. I don't know what the...
a lot of, I mean, I'm not sure if this is what this person's referring to, but a lot of people, when they're saying a living wage, they're referring to a single parent being able to afford a 2-bedroom house that's at least 1,000 square feet, and then pay, not have it take up more than 40% of their income. Right.
Yeah. And I don't think that this person even would be able to define that. I think it's just literally buzzword.
Sure. And that's like, there's all the, like we were talking about earlier, there's all these other extenuating circumstances for why housing is more expensive and all of that. But it's just kind of, it's kind of a weird, like 2-bedroom with 1 bathroom, at least 1,000 square feet, and not more than 40% of your income. It's like, okay, like you can make a lot happen with, $8 an hour. Like I know that's like, it's not a lot, but you can, right? Like it's like, okay, then do a studio apartment or move to a place that's not as expensive, right? Like that's something that all Americans have done ever since. Like that's kind of like at the core of who America is that you go to where the opportunity is. You live a life of adventure. You leave your homeland to go to where you can make a life for yourself. But we don't really have that anymore. So
yeah.
Anyways, you want to do the next one?
Yeah, we'll move on and then look at some of these replies. So
you replied to him.
Yeah, I replied, and I talked about a lot because I think a lot of my replies are multi-tweet paragraphs, kind of explaining the ideas a little bit in depth. One of the things he latched onto, because of course one of the things I was saying is that if nothing else, this will drive automation much faster in terms of self-checkouts, having fewer employees, and so then you've artificially increased the wage that people get paid, so the prices are probably going to go up for most people, but then you end up with more unemployment because the machines are replacing people at an artificial rate. So he replies saying, unfortunately, automation is the future. To improve and innovate is in our blood, and it's just how things will go. There's also the other perspective of a truly free market with an uncontrolled wage. There's got to be a bottom line and allow people to work and thrive. Now, first thing, and I think I reply to this, I'm not sure if this replies on here or not, but I'll just say, I'm not saying that automation is bad. I'm saying that there are unintended consequences from what you are arguing will happen if you increase the minimum wage to 15 for big companies in these areas, is that automation will set in, and then people get out of work, and then they can't afford those things. So you've displaced them rapidly beyond what the normal economy's price communication would say, that the worker value and the machine maintenance and purchase and things like that. So yeah, to improve and innovate is our future, and automation ultimately will be a good thing. But just like you don't want to displace millions of workers at the exact same time if you can help it, you want this to be a gradual increase. You want the market to be responding and for people to be adjusting and for it to naturally set on when the price is right and when the technology is affordable.
Exactly. Yeah. Like there's like I don't know how much like one of those automated check stands is, but there's definitely a price threshold for when it makes sense to get that as opposed to hire another person. And when you artificially set the wage floor up, then you force that innovation to come forward faster, right? Like you justify it for the business quicker, and that might not be a good thing for the business to do right away, right? Because maybe the innovation isn't like fully done yet, or maybe it's not fully ready, or maybe it's not at a price point where it actually justifies, which will actually lead to higher costs, right, over time. And you kind of throw this monkey wrench into the equation of supply and demand and pricing, and it kind of disrupts the healthiness of the flow of the economy. And where does he say? He says, to improve and innovate is in our blood. It's like, yeah, you're right. Like, that's amazing. But like, we have to improve and innovate in such a way that it healthily is adopted into society. And the healthiest way it can be adopted is when people voluntarily make that choice because they see that it's in their best interest. Not that they see it's best in their interest because, some government program said you have to pay this amount.
That really makes me think of the idea of transitioning to green energy, for instance.
Yeah.
Is people think of it as well, if we force, if we make it illegal or too expensive to do traditional means, then businesses will adopt green energy and we get desired outcome sooner. And it's like, yes, energy independence from fossil fuels, I think, is in the long term a good goal. I agree. I think nuclear would be a good step toward that. But regardless, yes, that is a good end result. But you have to look at everything in trade-offs. When you artificially introduce means that make fossil fuels too expensive or illegal and force early adoption of electric energies through solar and water and wind and whatnot, you increase prices, which hurts the very poorest in society, and you make food costs go way up, you make energy costs go way up, and that again hurts the lowest. So it's not a matter of do we ever want to get there, because I think that's probably a good end, and you always want to improve and innovate and develop the energy technology. It's a matter of doing it at a time when it makes sense so you don't hurt the people at the bottom, especially. And in the same way, that's what this automation argument is don't do it, don't artificially bump up the timeline, making these machines replace a bunch of people, and then all at the same time increasing the wage on these big businesses so that their prices probably are going to go up in addition to replacing them with these machines. And so now you have a bunch of displaced people who are out of work, and when they get a job, there are fewer $15 an hour jobs at Walmart because they've been replaced by automation workers, and then they have to go to other jobs and small businesses that can't afford a wage increase like that, and you just end up with this horrible trade-off. So it's not a matter of getting there eventually. I do think eventually we won't really have retail workers. It's a matter of what trade-offs are you willing to make to get there right now.
And that won't be a bad thing, right? Like, people think they hear that, they hear no retail workers, no truck drivers, and like, oh, that's going to be bad. But like, when it's in the right timing, when it makes the most, when it actually, in a holistic free market economy, makes sense price-wise for them to automate that is going to be transferred back to the consumer, right? Like, goods are going to be so much less expensive, right? So everyone's life will be improved. Yes, there will be people that are out of work, but they will also be able to, work a different job, maybe for even less pay, but still be able to afford nicer things. One of my favorite examples that you give, and I probably shared this before on the podcast, but like, the people that like benefited the most from plumbing and toilets was not, the rich people. Like, the rich people had servants that took out their chamber pots. It was the normal people, right? Because now, instead of having to go to the outhouse or you go in the street or whatever, they were able to have some sort of plumbing in their house that was sanitary, and they benefited from it. But it only made sense once it got to the point where you could actually implement it at mass scale. I was talking with this other person this weekend about like being early in terms of innovation is the same as being wrong. And like, talking with venture capitalists, they're really scared of not being late, but being early on an investment, because you can blow a bunch of money on some sort of new technology that the market's not ready for. And it's the same as being wrong, because it's not going to get adopted. And I think about like Skype, for example, right? Like, Skype had a 10-year lead on video conferencing and all of that stuff. But because they started so long ago, and then it kind of like waxed and waned, when it became time for like video conferencing to be awesome and like be used all over the place in virtual meetings, Zoom overtook them, right? Zoom and Microsoft Teams, because they were at the right time. They had the innovation. It was at the right price point. They, the technology was at a point where they could provide the bandwidth at a price that consumers could pay. And that's, obviously that's not the best example of free market stuff, because we had the shutdowns, which vastly accelerated it. But it's a good example of like automation and innovation coming in at the right time. And when you try and speed it up, it destroys the calculus.
Yeah. So then there's the second part of this tweet, which is if you want to go back, actually,
sorry, yep.
it's the boogeyman of, there's also the perspective of a truly free market with an uncontrolled wage. There's got to be a bottom line and allow people to work and thrive. And I do think we kind of addressed this a little bit earlier in this episode already. I think that Peter Schiff line on Rogan that you brought up encapsulates it the best, of how you can't pay someone $10 an hour who's only giving you $9 an hour of work, or whatever it is. And that to me is kind of where I go. I think that's a little bit more eloquent than my reply, which we'll go to now on the next slide, which I bring up automation, but the point I just wanted to give context for is that I said, I sure hope you've never worked a lemonade stand voluntarily or cleaned a neighbor's yard for an agreed price below minimum wage then. Otherwise, you're violating your own principle. So, of course, the idea being like, if, your neighbor, you're a kid and the neighbor says, hey, do you want to like mow my lawn for like $20, and you do it for 2 hours, and it's not $15 an hour, like, but you agreed upon that. But of course, you're not giving him more than $20 worth of value. He could probably take the hour himself and do it, but he'd rather pay a kid $20 to do that, or you sitting out there with a lemonade jar and some crappy lemonade that you made from a mix to people who want to buy it from you because it's a hot day at a yard sale or something like that. Like, they're paying you 75 cents, and maybe when the day's done, you've been sitting out there for 6 hours and you made like $8 between everyone. But of course, that's all been a voluntary thing. No one was demanding that you get paid more because the value you provided wasn't there. So this bottomless wage, scary idea is in reality how most people logically think when it comes to things apart from what we're programmed to think about jobs and wages and stuff like that. When you put it into real world applications, such as just setting up a lemonade stand or going around and asking if people are willing to pay you X amount of dollars to do what certain job, you think in real terms. But when it comes to being hired by a business and employed by a corporation, you all these programmed thoughts going, oh, well, it can't be below this rate for whatever reason. So here's his reply. I don't think that's a strong argument, as odd jobs have no legal binding contract, and those are done by kids 5 to 15. I'm talking about the young adults 18 to plus trying to get through college, or the rest of the adults out there. And I love that, because he's like, it has no legal binding, so who cares? And I'm like, right, that's what a minimum wage law is. Like, that's what I'm trying. Isn't that exactly what we're saying? Is like, if you remove that legal binding, then it wouldn't have a legal binding either. It's just like, yikes. Oh,
yeah. The whole thing about like with Amazon and their warehouses and stuff, and they're like, hey, like they should pay more. It's like, well, it's the people at Amazon warehouses choose to be there. If there was another job that was more desirable, either in the working environment or in pay or some combination of both, they would go and take that job. And if Amazon was losing people to those going to those other jobs, then they would have to figure out how to raise their prices to the consumer, or they have to figure out how to raise wages for their warehouse workers. And with all the public outcry and with people leaving and having a hard time getting staffing those warehouses, they have had to raise those prices, right? And that's kind of the beauty of a market, is there's feedback. There's feedback that says, hey, I think about like in the 90s in Cambodia, when and some of those other Eastern countries, when the United States had a really big thing about like clamping down on sweatshops and clothing stores over here using materials from sweatshops. And they're like, oh, they have to have these conditions, and all this. And so basically companies in the U.S. stopped buying materials and stuff from these sweatshops in Asia. And what happened was the biggest migration of kids out of normal working environments into child prostitution. Like, it was the biggest transfer of that ever in history, of documented history at least. And it was created by us saying that they couldn't work at the most desirable job they have, right? Basically, for these kids, it was, hey, I could either work at the sweatshop or I could go out on the street and prostitute myself. That was the two choices they had. And because we thought we could control it, or we had some moral high ground, and we didn't understand anything about it, we said, nope, you can't work on that more desirable job. You have to go choose this other thing. Without any regard for the consequences. And that's the thing about voluntary transactions, right? It's people are choosing the best thing that they can get. And the way things get better is when, we actually grow the pie, like we've talked about before. But by throwing that monkey wrench in there, like I keep saying, like you cause these unintended consequences that have really significant outcomes for these people. You know, children going into childhood prostitution, like that's really unfortunate. And it was brought about by us trying to have some sort of moral high ground. You know, these Amazon warehouse workers, like obviously the consequences aren't as high, but if they had a better job someplace else, they go and take it.
Yeah, and these kinds of horrible working condition stories that get out there, I agree. Like, let's highlight them and let's make them better through public pressure and outcry. But when you try to institute these top-down approaches, you're always going to miss something, and you're always going to bind people who are innocent in one way, shape, or form. I think the more transparent you are as a society and the more willing to call out things and as a community rally against something or hold people to standards voluntarily, you're going to get much better results rather than a government imposed rule where, again, it's one of those scenarios where the business will say, okay, so the rule is this, now how do we get around this rule? Rather than, oh shoot, our community is trying to hold us to a higher standard, let's meet that standard.
It makes me think of in Seattle, I think this was last year, the year before it, when that councilwoman Sawant tried to raise the corporate taxes on Amazon in Seattle. And Amazon's like, nope, we're not going to do that. We're going to stop construction of our headquarters over there. And she was like, oh, this is a victory. And then she was speaking about it. And all of the construction workers that were out of jobs showed up and were protesting her. The very working class she claims to try to protect were like, hey, like, what the hell? Like, you took away our jobs. Like, we were working and it was great. Like, stop, no more head tax. That was the chant, no more head tax.
Yep.
And
she, in her arrogance, was shouting back at them like, I'm trying to help you.
I know.
That is the perfect...
You dumb little construction worker. Like, God, man, that's so arrogant.
These politicians think that they know best for everyone else. They can control the outcomes and their lives, and that is... And we should just be following their little rule book and their game plan, and it will all be okay.
Yeah.
So... I think moving on from that, though, he also brings up the 18 plus point, and that's like, yeah, but most of these minimum wage jobs shouldn't be viewed as what I'm going to be doing for the rest of my life. And that's not how, if you look at the age span of most people and their wages, people don't stay in the same segment of the income earners, the same percentage their whole life. When they leave college or high school or whatever, you're in that lower percentage. And then as you get experience, you grow into that top percentage. And then as you get closer to retiring, you're going to be back lower again because you're not making your income. And so these kinds of jobs that people talk about them as they're not meant to provide a living wage or whatnot. I think that it goes beyond that, is the kinds of jobs that require or that are not worth that much money should, generally speaking, are not meant to be stayed in forever. If you want to have your lifestyle change and according, you should be building up skills and you should be able to provide more value. If you can't do that, then you need to find other ways to procure resources, because ultimately, as a society, you can't function if you're bailing out every single person who's not willing to do that. There are certain people who are unable to get more skills for, developmental reasons and whatnot, and I fully support them being supported by voluntary means. But the moment that you mandate everyone in a blanket statement who doesn't get that job, not who can't, but who doesn't especially, then you're gonna, again, as we saw in the COVID lockdowns, have more and more people defaulting to not working or only working the minimum that they have to, because then society is required through taxes or coercion to fund their inability to move up. So a lot of conservatives argue from this, these are meant for low-skilled workers to It's like, it's not even that to me. We're not even creating jobs
Yeah.
this is a college level job, really. There are just jobs that are just not worth as much as others, where the value you're creating is just not as high as others. And as you get skilled, as you become more of an expert, you can do the same work faster, or you can do it better, or you can do something new. Then you will be creating more value, and you can get paid more.
Yep, you're paid directly in correlation to the value that you provide.
Yeah.
And you're going to be paid just a little bit less usually. That's how it works.
Yeah.
So.
All right, and then more replies here. I think this is the second to last of our slides, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe, yeah. So, I'll try to pick up the pace here. We've been really just dissecting. But is it not worth $15? Because I kind of make this argument in the tweets, right? Talking about how the jobs just aren't worth $15 sometimes. Is it, quote, not worth $15, quote, or, quote, I can get away with a lower wage, quote, and make more money? And here's the telling line. I think this unravels the whole shebang. I guess I don't trust people enough to do the right thing in this case. Seeing too many people accept a low-wage job as life and struggle to get by. I want people to thrive. Okay. Is it not worth $15, or I can get away with a lower wage? Again, the market communicates into what the job is worth. If they can get away with the lower wage, that means that there are people who are willing to work for that wage. If Britt offers me $2 to shine his shoes, I'm going to say no. That's not worth it for me. But if he says, hey, I'll give you $100 to shine my shoes right now, I'd be like, yeah, I'll do that because that's worth it to me. And then the market in a normal situation responds. And then Britt says, okay, well, I don't really want to spend $100 on this. Maybe 50. What do you say to 50? And I'm like, well, okay, maybe. And you're like, okay, what about 55? And I'm like, all right, I'll do it for 55 because I've got other things to do today. And then that's the whole barter of it. So I can get away with a lower wage. Well, sure, it is I can get away with a lower wage, but when you have free people interacting in a voluntary exchange without meddlesome government regulations that bar people from entering, then the prices of what they can get away with is not going to be any lower than what people are willing to work for.
I would love to do like a man on the street thing where you go and ask people, like in some kind of more lefty city that hold these views, like what profit margin do you think companies make on their products when they sell them? What profit margin does Walmart make? And I bet they make like 40, 50, 60, 70%. It's like, no, they make 1%, and that's, I can get away with a lower wage. Like most of these companies they are paying. It's a constant struggle of paying what they can pay to actually make a profit.
Mm-hmm.
That they're trying to get as close to what they can do to keep people working that are qualified, while also being able to exist into the next year. It's kind of like when people ask, they do those man on the streets about like, well, what do you think the top 1% pay in taxes or whatever?
Mm-hmm.
People are like, oh, I bet they pay 10%. It's like, no, they actually pay more like 27, 30% of their income. And they're like, oh, that makes sense. Like that seems fair.
Yeah.
Perception is just unfortunately a lot different than reality.
Yeah. Yeah. So then we get to this line that I really think sort of unravels his worldview. I don't trust people enough to do the right thing in this case. Seen too many people accept a low-wage job as life and struggle to get by. Well, heck, I mean, maybe this sounds callous, but I don't think it's my job to pay for people who are, one, willing to accept a low wage and just get by. If your whole ethos is, I don't want to work hard, I don't want to work harder, and I'm just going to kind of complain and live on this low wage, I don't think it's my job to bail you out. And that's not, and regardless of my personal feelings toward it, that is not the recipe for a successful society and economy that helps people at the bottom. Because there are not going to be enough people who are motivated and willing to create and to grow that revenue and to grow that pie to provide resources to be accessible for the people who are unable to work and unwilling.
It's like if you reduce it to its like a simplest analogy. It's like there's 5 people on an island and every day they have to go gather coconuts. Like the person who gets the most coconuts to feed people other than themselves are held in high esteem, right?
Yeah.
Like people value them. They think they're awesome. They're going to have more opportunities. The person that just gets one coconut for themselves, every day, they're not going to be valued as much, right? Like, sure, you can get by, but you are going to be struggling to get by every day of your life because no one's going to share with you. No one's going to, want to help you out. You're not going to be valued. You're not going to be able to find, a spouse or a mate on the island. This analogy is getting weird, but you know what I'm saying, right? Like this hypothetical island, like what we produce directly ties to how society values us, and in modern day society, that value is reflected in our pay.
Well, yeah, and I mean, if we're building on that analogy, it's like the one guy who gathers a lot of coconuts and then also has time to start building a house. He's like, well, look, I'm going to build a shelter, and we're all going to benefit from this when it rains. But I don't want to I want 2 coconuts. That's just it is. I'm collecting 5, but I want 2 of my own coconuts for myself, and because I've gathered all these and I built this house. And it's like, if you don't have those people in society, then you end up with every single person each just getting 1 coconut for themselves, and they all complain, they're all miserable, and nothing else happens. But if you have people like that who are rewarded and incentivized, like, yeah, you can keep 2 coconuts if you're willing to build this shelter. Everyone gets under the shelter, and when it starts raining, more people do that. Guess what? You start agriculture. You start growing things that aren't just coconuts, etc. And you build society from there on out. But that doesn't work if everyone just struggles, and the guy who's in his spare time is like, no, you have to give all of your coconuts that you've collected equally to everyone, even the guy who's not helping you build a house. You're at that point, why would I even build the house except for myself, a small enough house for myself, and I'm just gonna live there and retreat and then get 1 coconut. But again, the lack of trusting,
it's not
of people,
sustainable.
Yeah, it's not sustainable. And then the lacking of trust in people is the other thing. And it's this idea that government is going to do the right thing, and when government does something, it works. It's a trust in an infallible system, and it's a trust in people, which is weird because I thought he didn't trust people, who are infallible people who are making these edicts. And it's so completely backwards to me. And I think he goes on in the last ones. Yeah. So I do want to sort of deconstruct this with that last line about how I'm not trusting people. Keep that line in mind as we read these last tweets. I have to gloat a little bit here. I see myself in a losing argument. Well, and then let's see. So I'd like a system that gives food and shelter by default alongside voluntarism. And the system should incentivize to create skilled jobs so people are paid in a way that they can enjoy life. Sorry, I'm trying not to laugh. I think a government is meant to set standards so we treat each other fairly and don't take advantage of each other. It's meant to help represent all people. If we do 15 an hour minimum wage, it's to provide relief to those who need it. It should not be permanent. I don't even really want to go in on that last point. It was such a left field random, like, what? How did we get there? Are we not just at the beginning of the argument circle that you were making about how it was unfair to pay people below a certain rate if it's temporary? I genuinely don't understand why he threw that in, because that undermines everything else he said.
I just don't see how the society he's talking about in his first tweet there would work.
Yeah. I think we're LARPing here, and we're just creating the fantasy world that we want. And so in this world, Pokemon exist, and there are dragons, and everyone's friendly with each other. It's like, cool, you can write all these things down that are awesome. That doesn't make it a reality or possible.
Yeah, and these type of people always make fun of, like libertarians or anarcho-caps, like, oh, you believe in a utopian. It's like, I mean, most of everything good in our society adheres to those principles. Like, I can logically get there. Like, this kind of system that he's advocating for, there's no logical way to get there. Like, It's built on a fundamental trust of people doing certain things and doing it joyfully, even though they're forced to, while also believing that people are inherently bad. Like, it just can't, it doesn't work. It doesn't even hold itself in its own perverse way of logic. Like, it doesn't make sense. No.
Well, it makes me think of the internet communists who are like, and in a communist society, I would be the artist for the creative arts center. It's like, yeah, you can dream of that society, kiddo, but I can tell you that's not exactly a job that's gonna be created there. So, I'd like a system that gives food and shelter by default alongside voluntarism. Well, that's not a thing then. Voluntarism is mutually exclusive with a system that gives food and shelter by default, unless the voluntarist system is an incentive structure where you voluntarily exchange goods and services, and food and shelter are provided at the cheapest possible cost to be attained by the most people possible voluntarily, which is done in a capitalist society. Capitalism is the way that you can get food and shelter by default, the closest you can get to that, while also having free exchange. Otherwise, you end up with very little food, very little shelter, and it's all given away for free except for the people in control, if they can even provide you with food that day and they haven't run out of the bread lines. So the closest that you're describing to this utopia is based on capitalism, which is harnessing the idea of selfishness, because that maximizes the food and shelter provided to the most amount of people accessible. And the system should... go ahead.
Yeah. Well, this type of system that he's describing, it only results by having people of virtue, people that are good, right? And you can only get there by having that capitalistic society where people are. I don't take issue with, but like a lot of people think like, well, capitalism is just pure selfishness. No, it's voluntarism where people are trying to make the world a better place and they're incentivized to make it a better place. Yeah, that you could say that's selfish, but like I would say everyone. It's kind of like when people talk about I'm not for equality of, outcome. I'm for equality of opportunity. It's like no one actually believes that in practice, right? Like everyone is working for their kids to have a better life than I had, right? Before when I was a kid, and my parents worked for me to have a better life than they had as a kid. And they want to make sure that their kids have a better life than maybe the kids around them, right? And that's not a wrong or selfish thing. That's like natural parental instinct to have. And to grow and make society better is, when it's left to do that without being forced on anyone, that a good person does that, right? And if we cultivate that, it results in more good people and more people that want to do good things, and hard work does produce those kind of people. And I mean, we see this, right? Like charity in the United States, at least, like private charity outperforms all sorts of public charity, by like a factor of like 10 to 1. I think it's like flipped. Like for public charity, they spend 70% of their expenses and taxes that they have on admin costs, whereas in private charity, they spend 70% of the money they take in on, or up to 90% actually in most cases, on the actual people that they're claiming to help, right? And so that you can have this society that this guy's talking about. It just won't come about the way that he thinks, and it has to come about by people becoming more virtuous. And I don't think by having a $15 minimum wage where people can, not improve themselves, not, struggle, not struggle in like the bad way, but struggle in such a way to improve themselves and become better people, we're going to reach that point.
Well, and then his next line in that completely contradicts that himself there too, because he says, the system should incentivize to create skilled jobs so people are paid in a way they can enjoy life. But if let's say none of those ill effects that we talk about, none of the perverse incentives exist by raising that minimum wage, well, now you've just made an incentive for people to stay in an unskilled job at $15 an hour. And so they're not going to be, you're not creating skilled jobs. You're creating jobs that are unskilled to stay at that threshold. And then more people are going to stay at that threshold, and they're not going to enjoy life to the fullest capacity. Once again, when you have a capitalistic society where you have people paid for small skill and they gain skills, and then that you create skilled jobs through the creation of wealth and through growing that pot and through paying people whatever they can do, what that's worth. And then, of course, we move on to the drivel about a government is meant to set standards so we treat each other fairly and don't take advantage of each other. And it's like, oh my, that is some Care Bear stuff if I ever read it. Like, it's meant to help and represent all people. Okay, at best, if it was meant to do all that, can you in your right mind argue that it's done that ever? I mean, even at its
fail, then
even at its most free, that a conservative might argue, you kind of had massive inequalities for women and slaves, right? Like, not to say that the U.S. is evil for these things; it's a product of its time. But the U.S. government certainly did not help that civil rights movement. Then you come to now, and it's like, oh great, this government that's treating each other fairly and not taking advantage of one another just shut down the economy and made sure that all small businesses could not open. You had arbitrary rules in Washington state, for instance, that made it so public construction could continue, but private construction could not. And all the meanwhile, we're bombing brown people in the Middle East. So I think we've done a pretty terrible job of having a government that sets standards of treating each other fairly and not taking advantage of people and representing and helping all. If that is your barometer for what you think government should or can or is doing, then you're so far off the mark. I don't know how you can have any, semblance of, I think that a $15 minimum wage implemented by the government is going to be effective by these people. Like, if his view is, yeah, the government kind of sucks, but at the very least they can implement, this $15 minimum wage and businesses can't skirt it, that'd be one thing. But he also has this utopian view of what the government is that's just so disconnected from reality that it makes no sense that, I guess it makes sense why he would think the $15 minimum hour in age would work. So, and then of course we talked about,
but it shouldn't be permanent.
Yeah, it shouldn't be permanent. Exactly. So then you go back to the beginning, like why shouldn't it be permanent though? You kind of beg the question. So, yeah, I think this to me, it almost was a look into, if you zoomed in, if you took any one of our cringe posts about minimum wage and economics and the economy, and you zoomed in almost to the thought process behind it and actually got a chance to talk to these people, I imagine so many of the conversations would look like this, because it's all about the well-intentioned thought. It's all about, well, I don't see why not. And if you're advocating for people to not have a minimum wage, you hate poor people, or you want people to get paid less. You're greedy. And they don't think beyond that. They can't grasp the terms of an economic reality in which they live, of a reality in which resource allocation and scarcity are things that you have to contend with, whether it's nice or whether it's mean. And so this was very illuminating in the sense that I think we really, really got to the heart of the underlying assumptions that are made in a lot of sort of posts that we like to take apart here. So I hope this wasn't too much of a drag, taking apart comment by comment, but I thought this was a pretty good opportunity.
I don't got anything else on it. But
yeah,
it was.
Yeah, I think we've exhausted the resources here. So that being said, if there are any takes that we've had that are cringe, you should let us know on our socials. Leave a comment, tweet at us, whatever you want to do. Follow us on our socials, and make sure to check out any new episodes you haven't seen through those mediums. So we will catch you on the next one. Have a great day.
See you later.